Hey everyone, welcome to Handing the Shame Bag, a show dedicated to survivors of child sexual abuse everywhere across the world. We know the numbers are huge. We know that more and more exposure is occurring, which is fantastic news. And we know that people need support in sharing their story, whether it's with a loved one, whether it's through journaling, or even if it's coming on a podcast like this. The aim of Handing the Shame Bag is to offer unconditional love and support to you as survivors, and know and have you feel that you are not alone. As with all shows, this is starting with a trigger warning simply because I don't want you feeling anxious or triggered while watching. If that happens, please do stop watching. Go to the show notes below and you'll be directed to some resource and support. I have an amazing guest for you, another one I know. We're so lucky. This is Elizabeth Melendez, all the way from Florida. She is an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, if you like. She is an author. She's a CEO and founder of the Foundation United. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me. Hi, Gloria.
Hi, hi. So look, great to have you here and all the way from Florida, no less. So yes, you and I have spent a little bit of time trying to coordinate when we could do this. So it's finally here and thrilled to have you on board and part of the Handing the Shame Back.
Mhm. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Okay, so as with all shows, we start with your personal story. It is on child sexual abuse, just as little or as much as you are prepared to share with us would be welcome.
Absolutely. Are you going to guide me or want me to just jump in? What would you like me to share?
Just please start at the beginning would be helpful.
Okay. Well, I think what I like to say is I grew up in a very fun, diverse family. So my family was my mom was from America. She was from the country, sort of rural, our rural country part of America. And my dad was from Puerto Rico. And my aunts and uncles were from Greece and Italy, and then more Puerto Rican. So we were very, very loud, very fun, very gregarious. But everybody came over sort of fresh off the boat, we say, with many generations of baggage, lots of generational baggage. So secrets and things they didn't talk about, things they didn't understand that they needed healing. So I always say it's generational, not intentional. And I had the most loving, amazing family, but chock full of what would fall under the category of childhood traumas, but very normalized, because it was happening to all of us. And I think I was the youngest of, 20 plus some cousins. And I just didn't know any different. You know what you know, that's what you grew up in. And so normalized for me as a child was verbal abuse, physical abuse, not happening to me, but witnessing it to the older cousins, siblings, um, emotional abuse, neglect, but present parents just busy with their own stuff and not with malintent. I just think that's who they were and that's what they came from. Sexual abuse started young, more like just within the cousins, really young. But that didn't even seem like abuse because that's sort of, you grow up in that and it wasn't scary or anything. I would say the first encounter with what I would call until much later was because I wouldn't have called the one with my siblings or with my cousins, whatever. I wouldn't have called that sexual abuse until later, having more of an understanding. It was more of just a normalization in the house of grooming and unhealthy behaviors. But when I was 12 or so, I don't know, maybe 11, 12, my mom's family from the country, we would always go there for the summers. And so I was in Chicago growing up. And then my summers, I spent a lot of time in the country. Beautiful, like my idyllic, beautiful getaway, tons more cousins, very different culturally, very Southern. And my favorite, I had a couple of uncles, but one of them who was not really my uncle, but like a family friend, his daughter, super close to me and just adored, felt safe, so safe. Every summer of my life, probably spent lots of time there. And around that summer, though, something shifted. And that is when um, I would first call my first encounter with what I would call abuse. And in hindsight, it was all abuse, but this was the one that was scary and left more of a lightning bolt. The other was more of a grooming type experience. But it was getting ready for church one Sunday in the bathroom and sort of came in behind me, which I never would have thought. I was in the mirror, just brushing my hair. And as he put his arms around me in a way he never had and just started feeling me, all of a sudden I froze. And it went on a little bit, and he just kept staring at me in the mirror while he did it. And I was silenced. And I think that's why now I'm so big on speaking and having people speak up because I know how it steals your voice. And I was just silent and I froze and I'm looking in the mirror and I'm seeing this little thing and I'm watching his eyes and I'm thinking, and it just sort of like slivered. I like to say slithered out of the room. It felt like almost like a snake. Like what was that? And then it ended up again in a car on the way. We were going to church and I ended up with him and more in the car and always staring at me. It was like a stare while his hand was going up my leg, while his hand was going up my skirt, while he was making his way up and I'm frozen, but he made sure to really look at me. It was like this controlling stare. And I couldn't look away and I couldn't speak and I didn't. And when we got to church, he grabs his guitar and he gets out, goes on stage to lead worship, and I'm sitting there. And it was just a devastation, like unreal. Like, did that happen? It's almost like one of those, did that happen is, what it felt like. And I never spoke of it. I never spoke to it. I went in, I went to the bathroom. I felt like I was in a soap opera. I loved all the soap operas back then, all my children, and I was like, oh my gosh, did that happen? Did that happen? What does it mean? But I was in my own little drama in my head. I didn't say a word. All of my cousins, my mom, my aunts, my uncles, I went out, sat in like front row. I think we sat in of a pew and sat next to my other uncle. And as he went to put his arm around me, I remember like jerking. And I think from that moment on, it ruined, my safety, my trust. I had, that's when your innocence is gone. Like I felt so safe with men. I didn't think about any of my uncles in a weird way. And it just stole that. And you know what I think is interesting that I reflect on often? My first book that I wrote was called Groomed. And in that book, I talk about how I never went back. And in hindsight, I think no one ever asked me, why aren't you coming back? But I think they all knew. And it's really interesting because I never went back and I'm like, man, no one even asked. Like, no one missed me, no one cared. But I think everybody was so caught up in their own trauma. And I think of how many, if that happened to me and I only popped in once in a while, what was happening in that town and how many of those kids and who would dare ask? And they, and it just, there was such grief in that as I wrote that book. And I really recommend that if you're a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. It's called Groomed by HarperCollins, and it's unlocking or coming out of agreement with the messages of your childhood that shaped you. I actually I recommend the book because it actually helps unpack it, and it was the first time as I was putting all the pieces together and working on it that I realized, it didn't start with that uncle. It started way before. And because of what was happening in my house as a child, I didn't have voice because I watched the other things that happened. Like mine didn't feel traumatic, it didn't feel scary, but um it was so unusual. And I watched the others get beaten. I watched emotional abuse. I watched different things and no one really said anything. So it really primed me. And then shortly before the abuse happened in the country, my sister had been, it sounds too traumatic to like say all this stuff, but this was probably the real cursor, the precursor to the whole thing is that my sister accidentally, when we came back from the country, my brother was putting away some of the hunting rifles and it misfired. And so my sister was actually shot and killed accidentally, like tragically, who was like my protector, my older sister. Yeah. So after my sister was shot, it was traumatic because we had all the cousins, right? I'm the youngest, and I'm at a family wedding of probably a few weeks after she died, where she was supposed to be a bridesmaid. And I was the flower girl. I was always the flower girl. And I remember after the ceremony, they kept a spot where she should have stood. So it was like bridesmaid gap or more, and then me down here. And afterwards, I remember going into like a corner and I had this really uncomfortable taffeta dress on. And I go into the corner and I was just crying. And one of my oldest cousins came up to me and she goes, why are you crying? And I said, you know what? I miss Diana. And she goes, you're so little. You didn't even know her. We're the ones that miss her. And I think that, so I think you pair together our early childhood experiences and it prepares us for how we actually respond to later events in our lives. And so I was prepared, I was groomed to not think that my voice mattered. My grief didn't matter. Everybody else's grief mattered more than mine. Their feelings mattered more than mine. So by the time I got abused at 11 or 12, I really knew no one cares. They're not going to want to know. They got their own problems. And so I never unpacked it. And then when I was in college, it was the first time I mentioned it. And I remember my mom saying, oh, I had a feeling, but we don't speak about that. We don't speak to that. And I remember going, what? But I think it's important to share, like, after I was abused, and I know this is statistically what happens. You know, I have my master's in clinical psych for almost 30 years now. And in my own healing, my own journey, and just working with so many others in sex trafficking and other places in the world, um, it's that open door of sexual abuse as a kid is just the beginning of choices that we then think define us. And I really, for me, that's why when I ended up leading safe housing for sex trafficking, as I was leading groups with the girls, I'm like, their stories sound like mine, like their experiences and their stories about their sexual encounters. I'm like, sounds like mine. There was just no money exchanged with me. Because that first hit of abuse, or that first hit that takes your innocence, opens the door to such immediate shame and such immediate self-blame and loss of self-worth and identity, that it automatically like starts, unless there's something that off ramps you, which so few of us get an off ramp immediately, that somebody's there to process with us, or talk about it in a way that actually brings healing. Like, that doesn't typically happen.
Yeah,
And for me, it didn't.
yeah, so I'm interested to know because once, you noticed immediately that your behavior around the grown men in your family changed, and where you hadn't felt unsafe, you began to feel unsafe. Were there any other sort of impacts you can share with us that, it might have been psychological withdrawal, it might have been just regress behavior, it might have been acting out at school. What sort of things did you notice as you look back and think about the child you were, and once, that
Mhm.
innocence was gone 11 or 12 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, that is exactly what happens when the shame entered. I literally stuffed it. And then I was in middle school, and it was getting close to getting ready to go into high school. And I think I went to my first party that weekend. And important to know is like how the quick shift of identity. I was known as like the good girl. My family was very into church. We had all this stuff behind closed doors, but we never missed church. So I was actually seen as like the church girl, the last one. The joke was always who's going to have sex first. It was like, oh, she'll be last, and she'll be married with a condom and on the pill. Like, she'll never, 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 like, she's so not that. And it opened all these doors. It opens the doors prematurely. So I remember going to a party, and I think it was probably seventh or eighth grade after that, and just being given alcohol and drinking to the point that I don't even remember because I'd never drank before, and blacked out. And when I woke up, they told me, oh, so and so had sex with you. You had sex. I'm like, what? And it was like a spiral effect of thing after thing of just, and then I'm like, oh, well, I better drink more because I don't want to think of that, because that's the worst. And so then every time I drank, someone would tell me, oh my gosh, so and so had sex with you. I'm like, what? So I went so radically quickly from the good girl to the bad girl, though I hadn't changed inside. Like, the thing is, I kept a journal, a diary the whole time. I never changed who I was, but I never had the ability to say, this isn't me. You don't know how to stop the train that's going. And so then it leads to number upon number upon number. So I go from, drinking and then having sex to, oh no. And then people are like, hey, do you want to try this? I tried drug. Thankfully, I wasn't a good drug doer, but I tried everything to numb, and then eating ended up being my thing of choice. I would do either blackout drinking and something would happen. And then the shame was so bad that I just wanted to shove it. So for whatever reason, I was wired that eating was my number. And I mean, to the point of eating like I would drive through a Burger King or something and get an order of something and then drive through again, like another order of, and say the word another, like, oh no. And such shame, shame, shame with all the things that I did and purchasing, like going to a grocery store to buy cake, but also buying candles. So I looked like I was going to a birthday party, like just to hide that I'm going to go and eat it myself. And no one's going to know what I'm doing.
Interesting. So I'm going to stop you there because what you're saying is so useful for our amazing audience watching. So hello, beautiful survivors. Welcome. Um, Elizabeth, as you talk about the numbing behavior and the addictive behavior, we know that for survivors, for us as survivors, when we haven't been able to manage it, process or deal with it, we do this type of addictive behavior simply so that we don't have to feel, because once we start feeling, that's when the horror emerges. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about that because, as we know, with bulimia, which is eating too much and then finding a way to purge, it's simply about filling up, filling up, filling up. So I wondered how you saw that for you when you think about your own experience. Is that something you would say as well? Is that, yeah, what was your feeling about that?
Well, I definitely didn't purge, but I ended up I had just had a lot of numbing addictive behaviors. And I think that's what happens when you try to not feel. Everything is shame based. So when you're trying to numb the shame, you do whatever it takes. So pornography entered my life at a young age. That's a number. For me, it was eating, drinking. I remember when I started working, I felt like there was two sides to me. There was like the real me that never stopped journaling, would cry out like, God, you got to help me. Like, how do I stop this? But I couldn't stop because I also had taken on the external persona of bad girl, and she just doesn't care. And she's actually kind of mean. And I just become a whole different part of me. And the two sides were completely unreconciled. And going down the path of the eating, the drinking, the sex, the promise, then it just became promiscuous. I was like, you know what? If a guy's going to use me, guess what? I'm going to get ahead of it. I'm going to use you. I will show you who's going to hurt who and who's going to. So I became the one that would try to make everyone fall in love with me and then break their heart. And then when I started in the workforce, like I made it through college somehow, like I knew I was getting better because I started running after therapy probably at 14 was my first encounter with therapy, but it would be little hits here and there. I went to Overeaters Anonymous, and again, it all really focused on symptom versus root. And for me, the root was way back here with what started way back in my early childhood before even the uncle. But no one really went there. They would talk about the symptoms, well, what is it like? What triggers you to eat? And why do you eat? And all the different. And then it went on where before I got, and I worked in the city. I'm from Chicago. I remember driving to work and just feeling ugly, feeling invisible, like no one's going to notice me. I'd stop, I'd shop, I'd buy new. I did anything to try to superficially cover. And I was in counseling. I was still doing my church. I was all the things, but nothing was getting to the root level of healing. So for me, I was on a journey of numbing and playing two roles for decades. I mean, suicidal at times, just decades of trying hard in my own power to look like I got it together. And I looked really good. I really looked like the package, but all of this hiddenness, secrets, so many addictions. And that and the funny thing is, like, once things come to the light, you realize what's not even an addiction. It's just a coping mechanism that you can't get rid of until healing comes. So for me, healing really didn't enter till I was 34. And in reality, that was, and I was in therapy the whole time. Like I had my master's of clinical psych. By the time I was 28, I had my master's of clinical psych, but I still had a double life of pieces of me from the trauma of my childhood that weren't healed. And I didn't have an encounter that like just sort of read my mail and put everything out there till I was 34. And then that's 20 years ago. It's still a walkout journey of reconciling and getting back to who you originally intended to be. All of these traumas like
Yeah,
just
of course.
steal, right?
Yeah, and I think too, though, there's that old adage as well, healer, heal thyself. And often for us as survivors, we find pathways or professions that help us to heal, and we're not always cognizant of it, as you say, at 28. What age were you when you would say you first started to move from the good to the bad girl, as you describe her? What
I
age?
would say around, I mean, eighth grade or so is when that first encounter happened where I had sex with somebody from drinking. I mean, shattered. I lost the boyfriend that I wouldn't even let touch me because it was actually like his wrestling coach, I think, or not his coach, the wrestling captain in high school that ended up being with me. And my guy was like a freshman. It was just the worst ever. So I
Oh,
think I didn't go bad immediately. What?
but were you 13? Is that eighth grade,
I
13?
was probably 12, 11, 12, 12, 13-ish. Yeah. And I didn't go to bad girl immediately. I went to like horrified, like, oh, can't believe
Yes.
it happened. And then when it kept happening,
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I'm just gonna have to put up a facade here. I mean, it wasn't intentional or conscious. It's just, it's shades of gray of like the real you dying, and you better just cover it up with the little hardened shell here because how else are you gonna survive?
So interesting. I mean, just a question. Do you believe through your childhood and once the sexual abuse began with your uncle or family friend who was considered an uncle, uh, do you believe anyone was aware of the change in you or the behavior, or did any adult ever ask what's going on, or are you okay, or did that ever
Yeah,
happen
I
to you?
that the ones that were from that area never did. And that was in hindsight a lot of grief. I had to grieve what I missed out on from just that whole door being closed and never going back to that farm, beautiful country life that I loved. I had cousins and aunts that cared so deeply. Um, and at one point I told one of them, like, how do you know if you're pregnant? I have a friend. And so the tech, the true, I have a friend. And I think I was about 14 at that point. And I remember my aunt taking me to Pizza Hut and, let's talk. Are you okay? And I just facade, didn't tell it.
Of course.
So it wasn't until I played the double role. I mean, I would go in and out. Like I threw myself into this Christian college by my junior year, and I would get like, oh my gosh, I'm back. And then boom, bad would start again. And so it had been a back and forth, and people always loving me enough, but not the right people, I guess, and not the consistency from my dad or my mom. And I think my sister being killed in the whole picture was just a huge piece of the internal. Like it wasn't just the external family member that unfortunately, turned bad uncle. There's a lot of that in the world, but my parents both sort of emotionally weren't after the death of my sister. There was just a longing. I think the underlying root of so much of it really wasn't the abuse. It was, does anybody really see me? I mean, a cousin seeing you is not the same as your mom or your dad really seeing you.
Not
And
a,
my mom,
yeah.
yeah, not at all. And she was always present, but my mom was, she cooked and she cleaned. And that was it. Like there was no emotional, like, honey, let's talk. And I
No.
think I longed for a parent. You have that hole that you want until you realize how else to fill that hole. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's what perpetuated the depth of it, the loneliness, because you're home. That's where you're home and not seen and can't talk.
And that's it. And that's kind of what leads to the silencing as well of the voice, because if you don't feel seen and you don't feel heard, you then don't bother speaking because you've already had it proved to you over and over that that's not available to you. So
Yeah.
you keep putting yourself through that, and adopting that false self is something where survivors can be very skilled at, and it can actually be quite hard to transition out of that. And for survivors watching, don't beat yourselves up if you still find that false self appears at times. It just simply means there's a part of you that's not feeling safe in the situation or interaction you're in. And I think it's important to always hold that hope. So Elizabeth, moving on, once you kind of got to late teens, early adulthood, what helped you? I know you did get your master's in psych, congratulations. What helped you move through this and recover?
Well, I had been really, what you said is 100% true. Anybody, like whenever I meet somebody now and they're working on their, psychology degree, I'm like, oh, have you worked on your own trauma yet? And a lot are like, oh, I don't have any trauma. I'm like, oh,
I
yeah.
don't.
You know, of course you do. And when I ran safe housing, I mean, all that I would hire are master's level little social workers. And I'm like, oh gosh, they were more work than the survivors because they didn't know how much healing they needed, but they were running after the profession. And so all of that work really didn't do it for me. I mean, it did. It gave me head knowledge. And when you have head knowledge versus heart level healing, it's very different. And when, for me, I had a lot of head knowledge. I could speak like nobody's business, but it didn't make it all the way down to the root level healing to give me back the depth of my identity. And for me, I do walk with faith, and I didn't have the reconciliation that I believe for me came. I feel like God had to hit me over the head and say, like, listen, little girl, you're going on 34. You're faking it for so long. Like, I got plans for you. Get your poop together. And so I just got radically blasted by an encounter weirdly, like, because I was very I wasn't fond of the Catholic faith. I wasn't fond of the church that I was going to in the country was like charismatic Pentecostal holiness, like all of the expressive. And I really closed the door to that. And I had a complication in my pregnancy with my third child. And I was in a marriage that looked really good on the outside, super wealthy suburb, and all of the things with my two first children and pregnant with my third, and I had placenta previa. So for me, what ended up breaking the cycle fully, and let me say, anytime someone says fully and I don't have any problems, they're lying to you. I mean, this was the beginning of a deeper level of my hurt journey at 34. I'm 55 now. But I had a weird encounter. A friend of mine said, "Oh my gosh, you have placenta previa. I have a priest coming to my house with a gift of healing." I'm like, "What?" And I went running. Like, "Oh my gosh, that's what my family that I'd been abused in was of that faith." And I was like, I saw it back then, and I did see some stuff that was legit, but I closed the door on the whole thing when that happened. And so I ran to this healing encounter with a Catholic charismatic healing priest, which who's ever even heard of that? But it was so interesting because he was so loving and so cool. And I feel like in hindsight, even in that, God wanted to reconcile my belief system because I was a very phony, fake Christian believer, which majority of us are because, you show up and you look good, but yeah, you go back and you haven't really, what you are in the building isn't the same as what you are at home. And I was sort of that. And I didn't even realize how much I was that. And it was so interesting because he said, "Do you want me to pray for this baby?" And I didn't even tell him it was wrong. And he just kept saying, "There's something blocking our prayers." And I'm like, "What?" And I'm like, "You stink. What's going on with you?" And he's like, "No, I just almost, because I feel like it must be more of a sin." I'm like, "A sin?" And I'm like, "What is with this guy?" But I had had so much repressed over my life and so much locked away because that's how you survive. So for those listening that are survivors, we have to black things out to keep going until it's time to let them come out to be healed. And it's a graceful process. It's not something you could rush. And he said, "I feel like it's more of a sin." And I'm like, "What?" And then all of a sudden, it was like I was 34, and it was like somebody had like given me a key and unlocked a door to when I was 17, and I had a memory. And I'm like, "Oh," I said, "I had an abortion when I was 17." And he's like, "Oh, well, have you ever confessed it?" I go, "Confess it? I'm not Catholic. I don't do confession." And he's like, "Honey, all the confession." He goes, "Do you believe in the Bible?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, James talks about, confess your sins one to another. Prayer of a righteous man has authority to heal. Like, you want to be done with it? I'm like, okay. And he says, "All right, well, let's pray." And he starts praying and he starts doing what my family did, like anointing me in oil and speaking. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And literally, he's like, "Okay, you've been forgiven." But he was so cool and so funny and so nonchalant. I'm like, "Okay, I'm forgiven." And then he goes, "God would have you do penance." And I'm like, "I don't do penance. I'm not Catholic." And he's like, "Okay, penance. You know what penance means?" He goes, "It means walking out your healing. You've had some secrets for decades that you didn't even know you had the secret. Like, you need some new patterns, muscle memory patterns, soul patterns that you need to walk out." I'm like, "Okay." And so he goes, "All right." He sort of gave me like protocol, and I'm like, "All right, I'll do that." And it was just like grieving. It was grief. He gave me grief work. My penance was grief work. And I had to journal and grieve, and it was beautiful what happened till the baby was born. But then he wasn't done, because then he goes, "Oh, well, you know what? I feel like God's telling me you have more open doors." I'm like, "What?" And so he goes, God's showing me you have an open door to pornography. So I'm like, so it's almost like he was just reading my mail and God was showing him what I didn't have the ability in my counseling sessions to bring up. I wouldn't sit down and say, "I struggle with pornography. I struggle with masturbation. I struggle with," and it was so embarrassing because my friends were sitting there who thought I was Miss Perfect. And he went on to, he's showing me you have an open door with verbal abuse. And I did. I still swore like a truck driver. I was Miss Church Leader Girl. And I had a different life behind closed doors. And he went on to talk about alcohol abuse and open doors to the occult. I'm like, the occult, and different things open the door to different spiritual realm. And I was just, each one, he was just kind, and he was like, well, do you want to be done with that? I'm like, sure, sure. And he just kept going, okay. And he would like pray a little bit, and he just went on through all these. I had a lot of things. And then at the end of all the things that he prayed about, he goes, well, now I feel like I could hear what's going on with your baby. He's like, I feel like God's telling me there's something with your placenta. I'm like, oh my God. And then I just started crying. I'm like, I'm so embarrassed. I'm sorry I lied to you. And he's like, do you believe you could be healed? So I had this crazy encounter with a Catholic priest that radically changed my life because it humbled me. And I think that's the bottom line. Like, I think when we're so abused, but we strive to not look like we are, and we're not healed, but we strive to look like we're healed, we're missing the humility that actually brings the healing. And this encounter actually brought such a depth of humility. I was very humbled and embarrassed, but he was so loving that I just wanted to receive it. And it went on to like give me the gift of tears. And I'm like, what is that? And he's like, you've hardened your heart, and God wants to give you back a heart of flesh, replace that heart of stone. And it was just crazy. I went back to my doctor, and she was like, your placenta previa is perfect. I'm like, what? So for me, I think I got out from under it when I was blind, awestruck by like the love of God, how he portrayed himself through this man, because I never saw that type of behavior in a church before. I
Mm.
saw a lot of judgy, abusive, fake, and it was like an encounter with just a truly authentic man of God. And from that point on, I did my penance, which is really just soul patterns of walking out new things. And so I think that was the beginning of a shift that, 20 years later, the work I do now is helping other people go through. We call it Real Talk. We have a program for that, for people to feel that and go through that. But every
So
time I lead it, I get healing, another layer. There's more. There's always more, right?
incredible. Do you, what advice would you give to survivors who may be new to their memories, new to their recovery? Are there any things, because apart from faith, which I can hear has played a huge part in your healing, were there any other modalities that you engaged in, like, therapy, meditation, yoga, anything you would kind of advise or tell us that may
Yeah.
be useful?
I would invite them to check out there's a website. One of the things that we do now is called realtalkcollective.tv. So REAL collective.tv, Real Talk Collective. And it has a few different pathways, and they're the combination. They open the door. Now, I said I didn't have an on-ramp for a long, long time. Um, they're an invitation to an on-ramp, because what I believe you have to do as a survivor is start speaking. And it's an invitation to either a private pathway, we call it, where we have some one-on-one. And over my 30 years in this space, I have a lot of people that I really believe in and have vetted that if you want a private session with somebody to start the conversation, we have that for you. And then the thing that I love more than anything is we have this group encounter that'll just blow your mind. It's not scary. It's so amazing how quickly it helps you normalize talking about what you never would, and healing comes. And it's just fun to enter this world. As we call it, a journey, and we invite you, and there's always next steps, and there's next steps. And you can send an email to freedom um, at the overarching thing is called the Foundation United. So freedom at thefoundationunited.org, and will help connect you to a group or a session, because sometimes you just need to know. A lot of times people are like, well, I don't know who to talk to, or I can't afford it. We're not for profit. We make it affordable. You can do it on Zoom. You don't have to worry. And I just think you need to begin. The new book that I wrote is called Speak the Unspeakable, Real Talk on Secret Sex and Being Set Free. And if we don't speak to it, the journey doesn't begin. So if you have just been wondering, like, I don't even know what to do next, I would invite you to join up with our team. We have a fun little army that's passionate about next stepping you. And then from there, who knows? It'll unlock whatever you're supposed to do next. And so we're a springboard. We like to be like a next step and a springboard, because each person listening, Gloria, they're made for so much. And we could stay so hidden and just think that no one would ever understand, or only you, and the shame is exclusive to us. But man, is that a lie? We all have been through so much that's so similar. And I almost don't meet anybody that doesn't have some sort of a survivor story anymore. So I would encourage people to just go for it and reach out and take a step, because the world needs you and it needs you to not be in hiding.
And look, and audience, just know that all of Elizabeth's links and links to her books and links to her foundation will be in the show notes. So they're going to be listed below. I guess the other thing for you, Elizabeth, that's what you've managed to do now and you've set up. And thank you so much, because what a big heart, and what a fabulous healing offering for people. That's amazing. And I guess I'm just asking you personally, what helped you? That wasn't then, but I guess what would be interesting for us is what helped you apart from the faith-based healing that you did? What helped you?
Um, well, that was the pivot because prior to that, I had done everything. I was in 12-step groups, I was in therapy, I was in, you know, every modality you could think of, EMDR, all the different things. I mean, everybody in my life was an inner healing psychology person. But for me, it was unlocking secrets that I didn't know were still locked up. So for me, you could call it faith or not faith. For me, it happened to be through a Catholic priest, but like our 1.0 Real Talk group is secular. There's nothing Christian about it. Um, it was unlocking secrets. I didn't go in there thinking I didn't even remember having an abortion. Like I didn't know. So if you don't know what you need to heal from, how are you going to heal?
Yeah,
We lock away things that we don't even recall. So some of the things that I think are most important is being able to speak to that which we've never spoken of, and being able to be in a safe enough place that it comes back. And so
yeah,
that's my passion now, is creating those spaces for people, because you can't get there by yourself. Often we just don't even know.
it's beautiful. And the other thing too, be interested in your thoughts on this. Um, with the amazing survivors I'm so privileged to work with and listen to, that, when we're ready to deal, when our mind is ready to deal, the memories will come or the teacher will appear. And I think that's just beautiful, because often survivors will ask, should I be doing something to try and push it? I can't remember, but I know something terrible's happened.
Mhm.
And I always believe, no, when it's your time, it will find you.
Right.
Yeah.
Never push it. Like if you're listening now and like something, I always feel like if your heart's beating really fast, then maybe you're ready to make this email and see what's there. But if you're like, no way, I mean, you will know. I believe 1000%. You never let someone push you into doing something you're not ready for it, because
You'll
it's a
know.
gentle process, beautiful, gentle process.
And it needs to be. And Elizabeth, look, just as we're closing out today, are there any final words of wisdom you would like to share with us?
I would just say that every person listening, like when I used to lead safe housing, I would say you are one in a million that you made it here. So I would say you're one in a million that you're listening to this show. It's no accident. And I would say you're so important. And there wouldn't have been such a strong battle to keep you from having a voice if your voice wasn't so important. So I would really encourage somebody, whatever their next step is, whatever they're feeling, to just go for it, because I think your voice is really important and you're needed. If you're not already playing a pivotal part that you know, because we always know that we know we're made for more. And if you don't even know what to do, reach out, because you're vitally needed. And I think the time is now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If you could just stay there on the line for a minute, I'll close out. Hey, fabulous ones, how lucky are we to have had this wisdom today? And, it's so honouring for all of us as survivors to be able to hear these stories and see how survivors like Elizabeth managed to traverse her way through to the incredible woman she is and the work she now does across the world. So, as always, I see you, I stand beside you, and I believe you.